A modest tremor registering magnitude 4.0 rarely commands sustained attention in a country accustomed to far stronger seismic events along its western margins. Yet in the quiet farmlands near Kuta, Missouri, where the Earth is not expected to behave like a restless boundary between tectonic plates, even a moderate jolt can carry disproportionate weight. The event, recorded on April 23, 2026 at 17:59 Coordinated Universal Time, did not fracture highways or topple structures. But it has sharpened a question that has lingered beneath the surface for generations. How active is the central United States really, and how much strain is silently accumulating beneath it? Why do comparatively small earthquakes in this region travel so far, felt across distances that would dilute similar shaking elsewhere? And more importantly, does a cluster of minor tremors surrounding this event signal a deeper pattern unfolding within one of North America's most enigmatic seismic regions? The magnitude 4.0 earthquake occurred at a depth of 11.8 kilometers, approximately 7.3 miles beneath the surface, just northwest of Kuta. On its own, the event falls into a category typically described as light shaking. However, its context is what has drawn renewed scrutiny. In the weeks leading up to and immediately following the event, a sequence of smaller earthquakes unfolded in close geographic proximity. On March 25th, a magnitude 2.3 quake struck 5 kilometers southwest of Holland, Missouri, at a depth of 5 kilometers, or about 3.1 miles. The following day, March the 26th, another tremor measuring magnitude 2.2 occurred just west-northwest of Kuta, originating 6.5 kilometers below ground, roughly 4 miles deep. Activity continued into April, with magnitude 2.0 and below events scattered around the same cluster of coordinates, ranging in depth from approximately 8.7 kilometers to nearly 10 kilometers, equivalent to about 5.4 to 6.2 miles. Hours after the magnitude 4.0 event, another tremor measuring magnitude 2.1 was recorded west of Kuta at a depth approaching 10 kilometers. This sequence does not resemble a classic aftershock pattern tied to a large main shock. Instead, it reflects what seismologists often classify as background seismicity, punctuated by intermittent increases in activity. In the New Madrid seismic zone, such patterns are neither rare nor entirely predictable. The region produces hundreds of small earthquakes each year, most too weak to be felt. However, clusters like the one observed in March and April 2026 tend to attract attention because they highlight the persistent movement occurring within a deeply buried fault system. Unlike the tectonic drama visible along the San Andreas Fault, where the boundary between plates is expressed at the surface, the faults beneath southeastern Missouri remain concealed under thick layers of sediment. These sediments, consisting of sand, silt and clay, deposited over millions of years, can reach thicknesses of hundreds to thousands of feet, equivalent to tens to hundreds of meters. As a result, the faults themselves are not easily mapped through direct observation. Instead, their presence is inferred through patterns of seismic activity and geophysical imaging. At the core of this system lies the Real Foot Rift, a geological structure formed roughly 500 million years ago when the continental crust in this region attempted to split apart. That attempt failed, leaving behind a network of weakened faults embedded deep within the crust. Over time, sediment buried these structures, masking their presence while preserving their mechanical weakness. Today, the forces acting on the North American plate are compressional rather than extensional, oriented roughly east to west. This reversal of stress has reactivated the ancient faults, causing them to slip intermittently and generate earthquakes. The geometry of the Real Foot Rift plays a critical role in how seismic energy is released. Stretching approximately 500 kilometers or 300 miles in length and at least 70 kilometers or 40 miles in width, The rift contains multiple fault strands that do not behave as a single unified structure. Instead, stress can accumulate unevenly across different segments, leading to localized clusters of earthquakes rather than uniform activity. The recent sequence near Ceuta and Holland reflects one such localized zone of stress release. Depth is another factor shaping the character of these earthquakes. The events recorded in this sequence occurred between roughly 5 kilometers and nearly 12 kilometers below the surface, corresponding to depths of about 3 to 7 miles. At these depths, the rocks are under significant pressure and temperature conditions that influence how faults slip. The frictional properties of these rocks determine whether stress is released gradually through small earthquakes or stored over long periods before being released in larger, more damaging events. One of the defining characteristics of earthquakes in the central and eastern United States is the efficiency with which seismic waves propagate through the crust. The older, colder and more rigid geological structures in this region allow seismic energy to travel with less attenuation compared to the fractured and thermally active crust of the western United States. As a result, a magnitude 4.0 earthquake in Missouri can be felt over distances approaching 100 kilometers or about 60 miles, and sometimes even farther, depending on local conditions. This wide distribution of shaking often amplifies public awareness of events that might otherwise pass unnoticed. Historical precedent underscores why even moderate earthquakes in this region are taken seriously. During the winter spanning December 16, 1811, January 23, 1812 and February 7, 1812, a sequence of massive earthquakes struck the same general region. These events, commonly associated with the new Madrid seismic zone, were felt across much of the United States. Contemporary accounts describe ground deformation, river course changes, and widespread shaking that extended over vast distances. The earthquakes also generated hundreds of aftershocks that continued for years, some strong enough to cause additional damage. Subsequent significant earthquakes have reinforced the region's capacity for larger events. In 1843, a magnitude 6.3 earthquake struck near Marktree, Arkansas, while an 1895 event near Charleston, Missouri, reached magnitude 6.6. These earthquakes occurred at opposite ends of the seismic zone, demonstrating that the entire fault network is capable of producing damaging events. Since 1900, moderately damaging earthquakes have occurred every few decades, interspersed with frequent, smaller tremors. The recent cluster near Ceuta aligns with this long-term pattern of persistent low-level seismicity. What distinguishes it is the concentration of events within a relatively short time frame and confined geographic area. The magnitude 2.0 to 2.3 earthquakes recorded in March and April might be dismissed individually, but collectively they indicate ongoing stress adjustments within a specific portion of the fault network. The subsequent magnitude 4.0 event suggests that this stress reached a threshold sufficient to produce a more noticeable release. Interpreting such sequences requires careful analysis of spatial and temporal patterns. The proximity of these earthquakes, often within a few kilometers of each other, implies that they are occurring along the same or closely related fault structures. However, the exact configuration of these faults remains uncertain due to their deep burial. Geophysical surveys and seismic imaging provide indirect clues, but they cannot fully resolve the complex geometry of the system. Another layer of complexity arises from the possibility of previously unmapped faults. While several major fault strands have been identified within the New Madrid seismic zone, many earthquakes occur away from these known structures. This suggests that additional faults exist, but have not yet been detected. The presence of such hidden faults complicates hazard assessment, as it expands the area in which future earthquakes might occur. The depth distribution of the recent events also offers insight into the mechanical behavior of the region. The clustering of earthquakes between roughly 8 and 12 kilometers indicates that the active portion of the fault system is concentrated within a specific depth range. This zone likely represents a balance between increasing temperature with depth, which tends to weaken rocks, and the pressure conditions that can either inhibit or promote fault movement. The fact that earthquakes continue to occur at these depths suggests that the rocks retain sufficient brittleness to fracture and slip. While the magnitude 4.0 earthquake did not cause reported structural damage, its occurrence within an active cluster raises questions about stress transfer within the fault network. When an earthquake occurs, it redistributes stress in the surrounding rocks. Some areas may experience a reduction in stress, while others may see an increase, potentially bringing them closer to failure. In regions with interconnected faults, this process can influence the timing and location of subsequent earthquakes. The new Madrid seismic zone presents a unique challenge in this regard because its faults are not arranged in a simple linear configuration. Instead, they form a network of intersecting and branching structures. This complexity means that stress transfer can occur in multiple directions, making it difficult to anticipate how one earthquake might influence another. The recent sequence near Kuta could represent a localized adjustment within this network, or it could be part of a broader redistribution of stress across a larger area. Geographical context further amplifies the significance of these events. The seismic zone lies roughly 2,000 kilometers, or about 1,200 miles, from the nearest active plate boundary in the Caribbean region. This distance places it firmly within the interior of the North American plate, an environment traditionally considered more stable. Yet the continuation of seismic activity here challenges that assumption, demonstrating that intraplate regions can host significant earthquakes under the right conditions. The sedimentary cover overlying the fault system introduces additional factors influencing how shaking is experienced at the surface. Soft sediments can amplify seismic waves, increasing the intensity of ground motion compared to areas with more rigid bedrock at the surface. This amplification effect can make even moderate earthquakes feel stronger locally, particularly in low-lying areas where thick sediment deposits are common. In the vicinity of Kuta and Holland, the landscape is characterized by such sediments, deposited by ancient river systems, including the Mississippi River. These deposits can reach depths of hundreds of meters, or several hundred feet, creating conditions conducive to wave amplification. As a result, the magnitude 4.0 earthquake may have been perceived more strongly in certain locations than its magnitude alone would suggest. The timing of the events within this cluster also merits attention. The sequence spans roughly 1 month, from late March to late April 2026. This temporal concentration indicates a period of increased activity compared to the usual background rate. Whether this represents a transient fluctuation or the beginning of a longer-term trend remains uncertain. Historical records show that the new Madrid seismic zone experiences periods of relatively elevated activity followed by quieter intervals. The foundation of this system lies in the Reelfoot Rift, a structure that formed during the early Paleozoic era, when the interior of what is now North America experienced extensional stress. During that period, the crust was pulled apart along a northwest to southeast direction, producing a rift basin where blocks of crust subsided by as much as 1 to 2 kilometers, equivalent to roughly 0.6 to 1.2 miles. This process created a network of normal faults, characterized by vertical displacement as the land stretched and thinned. That rifting episode did not progress to the formation of a new ocean basin. Instead, the forces driving extension diminished, leaving behind a partially developed structure that became dormant. Over geological time, sediments accumulated within the rift, burying its faults beneath layers of sand, silt and clay that now reach thicknesses of hundreds to thousands of feet, or tens to hundreds of meters. These sediments, deposited by ancient river systems, including the ancestral Mississippi system, mask the underlying fault network while also influencing how seismic waves travel through the region. The tectonic regime eventually reversed. Instead of extension, the central portion of the North American plate began to experience compressional stress oriented broadly east to west. This stress originates from forces acting at the plate boundaries, including interactions along the Atlantic margin and the distant influence of the Caribbean plate. Even though the new Madrid region lies roughly 2,000 kilometers, or about 1,200 miles, from the nearest active boundary, these stresses are transmitted across the rigid plate interior. When compressional forces act upon a pre-existing rift system, the mechanical behavior of the crust changes significantly. Faults that originally formed as normal faults under extension can be reactivated as reverse or strike-slip faults, depending on their orientation relative to the current stress field. In the case of the real foot rift, many of the older faults are favorably aligned to accommodate this new stress regime. Instead of pulling apart, the crust is being pushed together, causing blocks to move upward or sideways along these ancient planes of weakness. One of the most prominent features within this system is the real foot fault, a structure that played a central role in the earthquakes of 1811 to 1812. This fault exhibits reverse movement, where one block of crust is forced upward over another. Such motion is consistent with compressional tectonics and can generate significant vertical displacement. During the historic earthquakes, this movement was sufficient to alter river courses and create features such as Real Foot Lake, demonstrating the ability of these buried faults to reshape the surface despite their depth. The broader fault network within the New Madrid seismic zone is not limited to a single structure. It consists of multiple branches and segments that intersect and overlap, forming a complex three-dimensional geometry. Some faults trend northeast to southwest, while others align more closely with the original northwest to southeast orientation of the rift. This diversity in orientation allows different segments to respond to stress in different ways, producing a mixture of strike-slip and reverse faulting mechanisms. Strike-slip motion, in which blocks of crust slide horizontally past one another, is particularly significant in the context of the recent earthquake cluster near Kuta. Many of the smaller events in this sequence likely occurred along faults accommodating lateral movement, where stress is released through incremental slipping rather than large vertical displacements. The magnitude 4.0 earthquake may represent a slightly larger segment of one such fault slipping in response to accumulated stress. The depth range of these earthquakes, generally between about 5 and 12 kilometers or roughly 3 to 7 miles, corresponds to the brittle portion of the crust. In this zone, rocks are strong enough to store elastic strain, but brittle enough to fracture when that strain exceeds their strength. Below this depth, increasing temperature and pressure tend to make rocks behave more ductilely, allowing them to deform without generating earthquakes. The concentration of seismicity within this specific depth range indicates that the active faulting is confined to the upper to middle crust. The material properties of the crust in this region play a crucial role in shaping seismic behavior. The central United States is underlain by ancient crystalline basement rocks, formed billions of years ago and characterized by high rigidity and low levels of heat compared to tectonically active regions. These properties allow seismic waves to travel efficiently over long distances, which is why earthquakes in the New Madrid seismic zone are felt across such broad areas. The same rigidity also means that stress can accumulate over longer periods before being released, potentially contributing to the occurrence of larger but less frequent earthquakes. Above this basement lies the thick sedimentary cover of the Mississippi embayment, a downward flexure of the crust that extends southward from the Midwest. This embayment is filled with unconsolidated sediments that can amplify seismic waves, increasing the intensity of shaking at the surface. The contrast between the rigid basement and the softer upper layers creates conditions where energy is both efficiently transmitted and locally amplified, a combination that enhances the impact of earthquakes even when their magnitudes are moderate. The interaction between the basement faults and the overlying sediments also influences how stress is distributed. While the primary fault movement occurs within the basement, the sediments can deform in response to this movement, sometimes producing secondary features such as ground deformation or liquefaction. Historical accounts from the 1811 to 1812 earthquakes describe widespread liquefaction, where water-saturated sediments temporarily lost strength and behaved like a fluid. This phenomenon underscores the role of local geology in shaping the surface effects of seismic events. As monitoring continues, the accumulation of high-resolution seismic data will refine the understanding of fault geometry and behavior within the new Madrid seismic zone. Patterns emerging from clusters like the one observed in 2026 may reveal subtle changes in activity, offering insight into how stress is evolving within the system. Whether these changes remain confined to small-scale adjustments or precede larger movements is a question that remains open, rooted in the complex interplay of geology and tectonics that defines this region.